Welcome to this chess video, everyone. And so here is a game of mine which is pretty recent, earlier this week, and we have a really cool concept that I'd like to teach. So without further ado, let's just get right into the game. So I start off with pawn to d4, they play d5, I play c4, and now they have the Slav defense with c6. And so with the Slav defense, unlike the Queen's Gambit, when we play the Queen's Gambit, we both have different half-open files. And that is usually where each side is going to be making their play, or at the very least, putting rooks on those files. So generally, white will have a rook on c1, perhaps black might want a rook on e8, especially after they castle, maybe this rook will end up going to e8. But because the Slav defense is a little bit different, and so here, if we were to take, both of us would have the same file. And this just has a little bit different complications, something to be aware of from pawn structure perspective, but it's a completely fine opening as well. Now, of course, I'm not wanting to trade too early and have that much symmetry, so I play knight f3, continue developing. They play knight f6, all of this is super common. And now I play knight c3. And you may have noticed that on this move, as well as last move, I don't mind if they take this pawn, because then they're just giving up their center, and although they have a pawn for it, it is going to be very difficult for them to secure that pawn, because I always have ideas like a4 and other thematic ideas to try and win the pawn back, or get complete control of the center. And so that's why we don't capture there usually. But now they play an interesting move, which is a6. And a6, a lot of people call the Chameleon Slav, because it's got so many transpositions that it can go to. It can go to so many different variations because it can just keep changing to whatever. Now, against this move, I actually like to play a really deep positional move, which is c5. And the computer actually doesn't love this right away. If you run it at like a medium depth, I think it calls it inaccurate. But I think from a higher level, I wouldn't call this an inaccuracy. I think this is just something that maybe the computer isn't picking up right away. Now, the very obvious drawback is I can no longer exchange on c5, and giving up the tension for the sake of it is usually something to be avoided. But in this case, I think we have reasonable justification to do so. And so my entire idea is thematic, and I'm not going to take credit for it, grandmasters have studied this, but I am going to be playing against the dark squares, and especially if my knight goes to a4, it might go to b6 in a lot of variations. And so my hope is to kind of clamp down on those dark squares. Now, if they ever do advance b5, now they're not going to play this right away, but let's just say hypothetically b5 or b6. At some point, I could probably capture this, and if they capture back, notice this square is actually still weak. And the reason it's weak is, if we ignore the queen there, from a pawn structure perspective, this is a hole, because they no longer have pawns here that can defend this square. And if we were to go back before this trade, you will see that this square is still a hole, because there are no pawns here that could be defending this square. And so those things together make this a really good spot for me to put my pieces. Now, if they were to trade in that really bad variation, they would put themselves pretty vulnerable, because long term I might go knight a4, and I'm already attacking their queen, gaining tempo, but also my knight might go here, or it might go to c5 in some lines. And so keep in mind, this is also a hole. So we have a lot of positional play against those dark squares, and hopefully can get something for it. Now my opponent continues pretty normally. They play bishop to f5, a very common move in this opening. I play bishop f4 to get my bishop outside the pawn chain. I hope to play e3 at some point, and then have my bishop developed. They continue development with their knight b to d7, and now I follow through with my plan. Of course, I play e3, what I was fully intending, and now here come the more imbalances that start happening, because now they play knight to h5, which the computer actually claims is the best move here, and already they're trying to exploit the fact that I've put the bishop outside the pawn chain, but haven't created a luft for it. Like in the London system or many other openings, I might be able to retreat this bishop, but I've not done so yet, and so they're trying to win the bishop pair right away. Now, I could drop back. This is a very valid option, and definitely a candidate move of mine in the game. And if they do, I do lose the bishop pair, but I get a half-open h-file as compensation. So it's not the worst thing in the world, but it is something. Now, I wasn't so sure I wanted to give up my bishop pair just like that, and so I came up with an idea that I thought was fairly creative, which is bishop to e5. And my idea here is, now if they win the bishop pair this way, I am advancing my knight forward. And so this is actually helping me further my development. This knight for white is usually well placed on e5, and so they're kind of helping me, if they were to trade there. The other thing I'm also doing is, if this knight is on e5, my queen is attacking their knight already, and I might be threatening pawn g4, forking these two pieces. So I have a lot of threats with this move, and I'm sure my opponent saw this because they chose not to take my bishop. And now instead they play pawn to f6, which again the computer actually likes, and they claim this is the best move for black. And I can understand why, because it's forcing my bishop back, probably to g3, and then they're actually supporting e5. But we can see the obvious drawback that now their king is weak along this diagonal, and the fact that they've pushed this pawn might actually hurt their chances for castling kingside. So it's an imbalance for sure, but it's an interesting one. So black's king is fairly weak, but for compensation they will win the bishop pair. So I do drop back to g3, and then my opponent plays e5 right away, trying to grab control of the center, and now I don't want them to start attacking me and running me over, so I play knight d2 in preparation. I don't really want them to necessarily have the option of this and gain into tempo, and so now I've relocated my knight, but I'm threatening their knight with check, and so it's something they must address first, and this more or less forces them to capture, or play pawn to g6, and that would weaken their king further. So they choose to capture, I capture back with my h-pawn, and now I'm still not entirely sure which side I want to castle. Now, my king might be in the center, it might go queenside, although that one is probably the worst of the three options, and then of course it might go kingside. Just because my pawns are a little bit ruined like this, a doubled pawn from h to g is not really a huge deal. In many lines, I still will castle kingside, and my king is still fairly safe there. Now, I might not want to castle immediately, because if I do so, my rook is no longer on this half-open h-file. And so, right now I have to consider what is more valuable, my king's safety or a half-open file for my rook. And we can almost count this rook developed if we just leave it there. So really, if my king is not under attack, I might not want to castle right away. But if I am under attack, then I will definitely castle. So it's a bit of a waiting game of seeing how close they can come and kind of see where they're choosing to put their pieces before I decide where I want to put my king. Now they went bishop to e6, which I'm not really too sure what their idea with this move was. Perhaps it was just a relocating idea to try and secure their king. Maybe they're supporting more moving of the f-pawn. I'm not really sure, but this is what they ended up playing. And so I just continue developing. And if they give up that diagonal, because here it was pretty well placed, well, I can actually put my queen there, and I think we're doing pretty well. Very common looking move in the Queen's Gambit and similar structures. But I'm also with another threat. Because the rook is on a half-open file, I'm attacking this pawn twice because of the queen. And so they have to be a little bit wary of this. Now they probably do see the threat and they don't want to advance pawns in front of their king, so they play pawn to e4 and try and keep everything closed. But when they keep things closed, that actually gives my king a little bit more safety in the center and makes me a little more incentivized not to get castled yet. So I play bishop e2, that way I have the option of castling whenever I need to. They play queen c7, pretty good developing move. And now we have to be considering which way do we want to castle. And this is kind of more the theme that's more or less constant through this entire game, is where's white going to castle, if at all? Mostly between kingside or not castling at all. But we have to kind of wait. We don't want to castle instantly, because if we castle right away, we've given away the half-open file for our rook, and now we cannot escape from, the kingside. But if we leave our king in the center, not too long, but for a little bit, maybe our king will be safe enough, and if they start attacking it, then we can evacuate our king to the king side. So it keeps us a little bit more flexible by having those extra options. Now I chose to play knight a4 here, and continue my thematic idea where I might be going to b6 and trying to take advantage of some of these dark squares that's on the queen side. Now what I actually missed here was a really cool opportunity that I'll show a variation for, and so this opportunity was picked up by the engine post-game analysis. But it is actually the very surprising knight d captures e5. And I did not see this at all in the game because it looks like we're just giving away a knight for one pawn. But the idea is really cool, where I capture back with the queen, but now I'm attacking their misplaced bishop. And I have pressure not only on this pawn, but also on this diagonal here. And so I'm threatening queen or bishop to this diagonal, and the combined threats are actually really strong. Like, for example, if they just miss the threats completely, so they play something like rook to d8, already we'll just take the bishop, we're completely winning. And if they miss the threat there, but try and defend their bishop, say king to f7, then I can play bishop h5 check, and this pretty much forces pawn to g6. And now I think we can actually just crash through. We can even take, they take back, and then we're, of course, winning material with the rook. And if they don't take back, where else do they go? If they move their king over, they're just in so much trouble here. We take here, and their king is extremely vulnerable. Already, white is over +3 in this variation. But going back to the real game with knight to a4, and now they choose to castle. And I can understand why, because they've pushed their f6 pawn, so castling kingside would be a bit weak. And we already have this potentially half-open or open file if I do win this pawn. And so they probably don't want to castle on that side of the board. But this looks fairly risky to me because, this pawn is also advanced. Their queen is not really the best defender of their king. And so now we have to consider, how do we take advantage of this? The engine claims this is roughly an equal position, but I think white has the better play because they can use the ideas thematic to opposite sides castling. It's almost as if I'm going to get castled kingside, because whether I do so now or I choose to wait and leave my king in the center, I really don't want to go queenside. In this case, this pawn is just way too far advanced. It doesn't make a ton of sense to me to go this way. And so I can start playing as if we had castled this way. And so my idea now becomes, do I want to pawn storm? Very valid option. That is one very key idea with opposite sides castling. Or do I want to attack with pieces? Because you don't always have to attack with pawns. You can also use your pieces. Maybe like queen b3, maybe bring in more pieces, perhaps even sacrifices on a6, and ripping open their king this way. And so in this position, I kind of like the idea of pawn storming, but I thought it was a little bit slow. And although that is going to be the answer in most situations, I think, when sides castle in opposite directions, in this case, I actually prefer to play queen b3 and try and use pieces near their king to try and attack that way. So they probably understand this, and very similar to what I'm thinking, they choose to pawn storm against me. They play pawn g5, and here I actually missed a chance, which I didn't see yet, because I was still very fixated on the idea of dark squares, because this is what I had in my mind, and sometimes you're trying to over push for an idea, you're blinding yourself to the opportunities that present themselves. And this is a good move. There's nothing wrong with this move, but it does miss the opportunity to actually win a pawn a different way. I could actually play this knight captures e4, and my knight is safe because if they ever capture, my queen can take their bishop. So that would have just won material, and that move stayed there for one or two moves. But I play my move here, which is a check, so they must respond to it. And I like this because it more or less forces the trade in knights, but I take back with the pawn, not the queen. And the reason why is I'm trying to attack their king. And by attacking their king, I don't want to trade away my biggest attacker and go into an endgame. So we're definitely playing pawn here and trying to restrict them to defense near their king. They retreat their queen back defensively. And now again, I do have this really cool move. It would be very good in this position. But instead of that, I played rook to c1, which again, attacking with pieces. In this case, I am putting the rook on a really good half-open file here. And perhaps I might have ideas, maybe something like bishop captures a6. If they take back, the rook might be able to take on c6 at some point. And so not always do you just have to pawn storm. Sometimes you can use pieces and open files to attack the enemy king. Now they play bishop to d6, trying to develop some more. Perhaps even attack g3 in some lines because the bishop and queen battery. But now I find the move, and this is a really good time to play knight captures c4. And of course, this knight also defends this square even further, so this is, I thought, a pretty good idea. They play bishop to f5, just accepting their down a pawn. And I'm not so sure about this. I thought in the game that maybe bishop to e7 was better because it defends this pawn and avoids trading pieces more. I don't think they really want to have me trade here, so bishop e7 evacuates this piece, also defends f6. But maybe they're still losing because rook to h6. It's a bit clumsy, I think, but it is attacking this pawn, and I think it's actually kind of hard for them to defend. So maybe this is why they didn't go for it. I'm not really entirely sure, but bishop f5 was their try. And so now I have the option of taking this bishop, but I also have the option of taking this pawn, which might look a bit greedy, but in this case, I think we can safely take it. I don't think them having a rook here is going to be problematic for us, because we have not castled yet. And so, my king might even go to d2 in some lines if I really want. Also, if I do get castled, my rook will be defending this pawn from f1. So I think as long as we're not letting the file open up completely, and my king is not too exposed, I think we can safely take the f6 pawn. So I do grab this, and now kind of a desperation attempt, I think, where they play bishop captures g3. And what I'm sure they're counting on is they're hoping that I take their bishop, and then their queen gets active, and I can no longer castle because my king is in check. I think I'm actually okay there, maybe king d2 or something, but it's unnecessary complications, and I don't really have to give them counterplay, because here, I think white is the one attacking, not really black. And so I don't need to take their piece and help their queen get active. Their queen is very passive here, and so I can find other ways to attack. Now, one extremely cool idea here, which I did not see in the game, actually in combination with this bishop, have a really strong attack on their king by actually starting with the rook sacrifice. And this, of course, I did not see, because if they do take, this is just so strong, because the pawn is controlling this, the bishop is controlling this, and the knight is controlling this. And so they actually have to give away their queen in this line. And that's the only way to defend this. So, of course, that is completely winning for white at the cost of giving up a rook. But I didn't see that in the game. And, you know, this is still a pretty good option that we ended up playing. So I played knight captures d5. And the idea, of course, is this pawn is still, you know, pinned, so it cannot capture my knight. And if, of course, they capture with the rook, I'll just take with the queen and I'm up material, and they're just not able to win anything. So they also have to be a little bit careful, too, because another threat I'm threatening is knight to e7 check. That would be a check here, and also picking up the bishop. So they chose to retreat in such a way that they can defend this square from the knight check. They played bishop to d6, trying to defend. But now I found another attacking idea, and it's just one slow thing after another. Now, my knight I can just leave here because it's in no pressure yet. And so I actually found a cool motif of pawn to e5. And the pattern we're going for here is I'm just decoying their bishop. It is that simple. Because I noticed this would be a really strong diagonal to get my bishop on. But I can't do that if they're there. And so if they retreat back, or if they take my pawn, my bishop to g4 I think will be a very strong move. And if they bring their bishop back, we might even continue the attack in the center with a move like e5. So here I think they are really pressed for options. And so they chose to take the pawn. But now I play the bishop to g4 check. And they're pretty much forced to block with the rook. They don't really want to give away their bishop for nothing. But now here, I don't need to take the rook, because that rook is pinned, and it isn't going anywhere anytime soon. And so I find another creative attacking idea to keep the attack up. I just add pressure to the pinned piece, knight f6. Also a fork, because it is forking the bishop and rook, but primarily I'm adding more pressure to this rook. And so now they chose to take this pawn, and here I found an idea I really liked. Again, not taking this pin piece, but realizing that it has nowhere to go, I can actually play rook captures h7. And keep in mind, this rook is still pinned, and in the game they ended up taking here. Probably with thinking that maybe when I take here, you know, it's just an exchange or something, it's not a big deal. But what they don't realize is this gives up the back rank. And so now, queen to g8 check, and this is going to be checkmate on the next move, because this rook is still pinned, and it cannot retreat. So they'll just have to throw away their bishop, and then queen to f8 is checkmate. So how did all of that happen in this game? Because it seemed like it was just one thing after another, and then all of a sudden, it was just there. But really, I think what the main idea was, although not so obvious, was probably a position like this, where I have the option of castling in either direction, but I'm actually choosing not to get castled right away. And like we mentioned, queenside is probably not too appealing in this exact position, but mainly it's between kingside or not castling at all. And I think a lot of beginners are going to be very quick to castle kingside. And to be fair, castling kingside I think is actually a fine move here, and your king is fairly safe, even if your king is on g1 and this pawn on h2 is missing. But with that being said, I don't really want to give up control of this half-open file, and my king is in no danger right now. And all of that is primarily because the center is closed. We have all these pawns here, and this actually kind of helps shelter my king in the center. Now, if the center was open, it might be a completely different story, and I might want to get castled right away, as I'm sure you've seen many games where your king is left in the open and gets checkmated very quickly because it doesn't get castled. So sometimes you don't want to castle right away, but I think other than that, the main takeaway was because I'm in the center or on this side of the board, I have a little more freedom as if I had castled that way, and chose to play opposite sides castling. Now, especially when they castle, I really have the two choices between starting a pawn storm or playing with pieces. And playing with pieces might be something like queen b3, rook c1, and in the game I chose to play with pieces against our king, but it is going to matter the exact position, and as the chess player, you get to decide how you want to choose to continue the attack. Well, I hope this video is instructional for everyone, and I will see you in the next chess video.